Do you ever think about the legacy that you want to leave to this world? Then you might love this week's business book review. How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen was a book that I discovered when reading Management Mess to Leadership Success. The author of that book, Scott Miller, whom I respect immensely, said that Clayton's book was one of his favorite books of all time. So naturally I had to read it. By the way, I've already reviewed Scott's book in this series. So check out that review if you want to find out why I respect him so highly. Now, if you're not familiar with Clayton Christensen, he's the author of The Innovator's Dilemma, which has been regarded as one of the most provocative and significant business books ever written. Steve Jobs said that he was deeply influenced by Christensen's book, and that helped him when he returned to Apple. So admittedly, I gave this book some high degree of significance before I even opened it. All right, that's enough praise for the author, but let's review the book. I'm conflicted about this review, not because of how I feel about it. I loved the book, definitely a 4 out of 5 head tilts. And I think if I were married with kids, it would have absolutely been a 5 out of 5. Usually, I like to contextualize these book reviews so you know whether or not it might apply to you with where you're at on your entrepreneurial journey. That's where I struggle, right? This is one of those books that I think everyone in their 20s should read, but unfortunately only people in their 50s would truly appreciate. The book strikes a good balance between professional leadership skills and living a virtuous life. It's not a self-help book, but it's not really a traditional book on leadership either. And perhaps had I read this book instead of listening to it, maybe that distinction might have been a little bit more clear to me. I tend to find that my attention isn't quite as strong when I'm listening to a book versus reading them. If I were to give this book a comparison, I think you could draw some parallels to the book Principles by Ray Dalio, one of my all-time favorite books. So because of that, I'd say this book would probably be most appreciated by entrepreneurs who've grown their company to a performance or growth enterprise or a large corporation. This book tackles some big concepts like what kind of a legacy you want to leave. And I think most entrepreneurs who've successfully crossed the desert, they've achieved either a growth or a performance or even a large scale corporation. They're the ones that tend to start thinking about like what type of a legacy they want to leave. By the way, if you're not sure what phase you're at in the entrepreneur's journey, or even if you just want to know more about those various stages, check out my business book scorecard. It's a free Q&A that takes just a few minutes. And at the end, you're going to get a curated custom list of the top 10 books for you based upon where you're at in the specific entrepreneurial journey. The reality is all books could become a 5 out of 5 if you read them at the right time in your business development. Why waste time reading books that don't apply directly to you? I've already sorted through over 500 business books to share with you the top 10 books that I feel directly apply to where you're at in that journey. It's fast, it's free, the link is inside the description. All right, let's get back into this review. Throughout the book, you're going to be reminded of sound first-order principles in business and leadership. But the focus isn't really about business as much as it is about life in general. The book is separated into 2 parts. Part 1 is about finding happiness in your career, and then part 2 is about finding happiness in your relationships. But admittedly, I kept finding myself identifying a concept, say, about relationships that was equally applicable to business and vice versa. Here's an example. He talked about his counterintuitive approach to happiness in relationships, where the path to happiness in a relationship isn't just about finding someone you think is going to make you happy, but true happiness is about finding someone who you want to make happy. Or as he says, someone whose happiness is worth devoting yourself to. That was clearly in part 2, right? But I couldn't help to think about how if we as business owners applied that to hiring employees on a similar criteria, like how much more invested would we be in developing them and helping them to grow? Here's some more excerpts from the book that really stood out to me. 93% of all companies that ultimately become successful had to abandon their original strategy because the original plan proved not to be viable. In other words, successful companies don't succeed because they have the right strategy at the beginning, but rather because they have money left over after the original strategy fails. If you defer investing your time and energy until you see that you need to, chances are it will already be too late. Because if the decisions you make about where you invest your blood, sweat, and tears are not consistent with the person you aspire to be, you'll never become that person. One of the best ways to probe whether you can trust the advice that a theory is offering you is to look for anomalies, something that the theory cannot explain. Decide what you stand for and then stand for it all the time. One of the most significant parts of the book for me was when he compared whole cost versus marginal cost thinking. In evaluating doing business as usual or innovating to remain competitive, traditional thinking is to ignore sunk and fixed costs and instead base the decision on marginal costs and revenues that each alternative entails. And Clayton thinks that this is a very dangerous gambit in business, as Blockbuster Video would demonstrate. But for me, the part that really made an impact wasn't using this logic in business, but to use it in life for the things that you stand for. Here's what I mean. Think of something in your life that you stand for, maybe a moral, ethical, philosophical, or even something as simple as a dietary standard or exercise routine. The moment you start using marginal cost thinking or a just this once type justification, you get on a slippery slope that will have a whole cost impact. Because the first time that you make an exception to the rule, it makes doing it again easier. And it just keeps getting easier and easier to make an exception until the exception becomes the standard. In other words, we end up paying for the full cost of our decisions, not the marginal costs, whether we like it or not. Now, if you've read the book, let me know your thoughts about it. And if you do end up reading it, I hope you can come back and share in the comment sections the parts that stood out for you the most, so anybody else watching this could benefit from your insights as well. If you enjoy these reviews, I'd be honored if you hit that like button and subscribe as well, so that when I release another book, you're going to be one of the first to know. Until the next book review, please, let's both try a little harder to be a little better. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch that book review. If you liked it, I think you might like this one as well. Check it out.